Hello and welcome. My name is Katelyn Proctor and I am the founder of PT Exam Prep. For those of you who don't know us, we work with Canadian and international students to help them prepare for their upcoming written and practical national exams. We have helped hundreds of therapists become licensed physiotherapists in Canada. I'm joined here today with Igor Kharif. Hello, Igor.
Hi, Katelyn.
Hi. So what we're going to be talking about today is a little bit about what private practice looks like in BC. So I'll let you take over from here.
Thank you, Katelyn. Let me first of all say that what you do here helping the internationally educated physiotherapists to pass the exams is amazing, and I wish something like that existed when I moved to Canada. I moved here 9 years ago.
Yeah.
And I had to figure it all out on my own. I was lucky I passed. Many of my colleagues didn't. So it's great what you're doing, and it helps a lot of therapists to be able to practice in Canada, and that's a great thing. I'll touch a little bit about myself. I moved here 9 years ago from Israel. I started working on my third day in Canada. I was very lucky. I'm fairly quickly, after passing my exams, I got into clinic ownership. I had a number of clinics in Vancouver area, and currently I hold two fairly large multidisciplinary clinics in Tri-Cities area, Coquitlam, Port Moody. So my goal here is I think I've been very lucky, and I would like to help others understand how private practice works, what are the issues related to it, because there is really not enough information online, and it's all kind of word of mouth, and I've been misled numerous times by different clinics and clinic owners, and I would like to give some sort of basic background for everybody who's new here.
No, that's awesome.
Okay, so we have a little presentation here, so we'll just go on with it. So private practice, we're really going to review today the three topics. One would be employment and contract options. Other would be more specific of contractor contract, so to say. And the last issue, I want to review some of the College of British Columbia standards of practice, which is important to know. In terms of employment options or contract options that exist, there are most commonly 4 different options. You can either be a regular employee, you can be a commissioned employee, you can have a rental fee, or you can be a subcontractor with fee for service split. So let's go over all of those options. Regular employee it's the typical type of employment like most people work. It's an hourly or annual wage. It will include all the benefits that labor law demands: vacation day, WCB coverage, Canada pension plan, employment insurance. It may include sometimes other what's called extended benefits, such as health, better vacation, continuing education, sick days, flex days, family days, retirement saving plans, and other things. Normally in private practice, the wage would range anywhere between $35 to $50 per hour. And it can be a little bit more for specific things. For example, a hand therapist sometimes get paid slightly above $50 per hour. Again, I have to stress all the wages and numbers I bring in, they're open to negotiation, and it will depend between different employers, different parts of province. The rule of thumb, generally in big cities like Vancouver or Victoria, the pay rates are slightly higher than, let's say, in smaller cities that are outside of Lower Mainland. Typical for public practice, this type of employment is really common in public practice, hospitals, rehabilitation centers, but it's fairly uncommon in private clinics. As we will see later on, subcontractors simply receive much better compensation. So there is very few clinics that actually offer employment option. And the reason being, usually the physiotherapist, the therapist doesn't really like this option. And I'll go over this a little bit in. So employee option can be an excellent choice for somebody who is just starting out. as there is really no risk involved with being contracts. There also something to be considered, somebody who just starting out in the country, it's nice to be employee if there is some health benefits. I think it's a great option for many therapists who want private practice, but not necessarily ready to be a truly independent contractors with all the advantages and disadvantages that come with it, which we'll touch base on a bit later. It also, another little point to consider, it is good to be employee if you plan to having kids, if you're planning a maternity leave. The reason being, if you, in other case scenario, you're simply not going to get any coverage from government, which is quite significant here in BC. So regular employee is a good kind of position for somebody who plan to start or expand family. It also then guarantees that after the maternity leave is done, I believe it nowadays up to 18 months, you'll have a job to come back to by law. You'll have place saved for you. Does this make sense, Katelyn? Any questions?
Yeah, no, that sounds great so far.
Okay, perfect.
There's definitely some pluses and minuses to doing the employee route, so it's interesting to hear.
Okay, let's move on. Another option that becomes somewhat popular now is the commissioned employee, which is the combination essentially between employee position and a contractor, where therapist still receives a percentage of billings like we would expect from contractor, but usually it will be lower percentage. For example, if a typical split between therapists in the clinic is 50%, a lot of time it would be something like 43% for a therapist in commissioned employee scenario, simply because the employers then have to pay vacation, which about 4% of salary, has to pay CPP, which is, if I remember, 2.5%, EI, and so on. So that comes to about 7-8% for expenses for employer. So obviously that's going to make the whole split for the therapist lower. And other certain disadvantage of that, there is no tax benefits for commissioned employee. Commissioned employee is still going to be taxed on the whole amount of their wage. Let's say they make 5,000 a month as hourly and 5,000 a month as commission. They still going to receive complete 10,000 taxable. And in my opinion, it's somewhat worse of both worlds when you get taxed on the full amount, and on the other hand, you don't enjoy the higher income of contractors, but this option does exist.
So, Igor, do you see a lot of clinics offering this?
Oh, sorry, I clicked too far. Let me go back. I know of couple clinics offering that. Some of the largest clinic in Vancouver start to offer that. The reason why clinics switch to this model from their end is the difficulty with CRA regulations in terms of independent contractors.
Right.
I'll touch on that a little bit when we'll get to contracts, but there is certainly a bit of gray area in terms of Canada Revenue Agency, who's considered contractor and who's not. Commissioned employee position kind of eliminates this risk of being audited, because you're still a 100% employee, but you still receive a percentage of billing.
Okay, thanks.
I hope it makes sense. It is quite confusing, but hopefully as we go through it, it will make a little bit more sense. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. There is also option, becomes very popular now, of straight rental agreement, usually for one room, sometimes for a couple of rooms. And in example, there is a $2,000 rent or lease, if you'd like to call it that, agreement per month, when the practitioner has access to the room for a certain number of days or hours a week. It will usually include additional services as point of sale machine, credit card machine, laundry, some supplies, some reception, may have access to the website, for example. Rent is usually would go on those arrangements anywhere between $500 to $2,500 based on what is offered. Obviously, you get what you pay for. Something for $500, you're very likely to get a room without much other than the bed. For $2,500, it would be more like full service when there is reception, laundry services, some supplies, etc. It usually would be large multidisciplinary clinics where many different practitioners rent different rooms. Usually, therapist will still have responsibility to do all the marketing, bring his own caseload, look for his own patients, probably will have some responsibility over billing issues, will definitely need to buy some of his own supplies as well, specific to his or her practice. It's an excellent option for a really busy and independent therapist. It offers by far the greatest opportunity for profit. I'm not sure this is, and the other big advantage is, of course, it's CRA compliant, because this is a true leasing agreement. You just rent a room and you don't get much else in return. So CRA won't have a problem usually with this arrangement. You can still be 100% self-employed. It really becomes now more and more popular as many therapists prefer to work on their own. However, it's not appropriate for a therapist who requires a supervision plan, since, well, there is obviously cannot be a supervisor in this arrangement. Right. It also won't be that good for therapists who just starting out, because you can rent a room, but where you gonna get the clients? The other things that you have to consider, it won't have a big physio-specific equipment. As I said, it's usually a multidisciplinary clinic, so they'll have maybe some basic things, but you don't expect any traction machines, any heavy-duty electro, any large rehabilitation gyms. It simply would be up to the physiotherapists to supply themselves in such situation. And of course, things like gym, you can't bring it with you, so it will usually limit the practice to some kind of niche, what I call the niche practice, like pelvic floor or TMJ specific, maybe craniosacral, maybe vestibular, essentially something that can be done out of a room, not necessarily having access to a large rehabilitation facility. And just one word of advice, there is many clinics that offer this model. I would strongly recommend somebody who's starting their career in Canada, whether they're fully registered or still on supervision, try to go where the physiotherapy owner is in place, because otherwise there can be a lot of different things you may not necessarily be aware of. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
Okay. And of course, the most common option that 95% of physiotherapists work in BC is the independent contractor or independent subcontractor, it's called. Therapist acts as totally separate independent business entry. There is no employee benefits, there is no vacation, there is no sick days, there is no maternity leave. Normally it would result in split of 50-50 of received billings. It's really important to understand what received billings are. Almost every clinic would pay out this 50% of the billings they received. For example, if you have a patient that didn't pay for some reason, he forgot his credit card, he ran away, his insurer didn't cover his visit, essentially the therapist also takes a hit. Clinic will only pay for what they received. This kind of splits, by the way, I'm not sure what's going on in other provinces, but as far as I understand, in Alberta and Ontario, the splits are quite significantly lower.
Yeah, so that's definitely what we've heard too. Definitely across Canada, Canada has one of the more competitive fees, BC has one of the more competitive fee splits versus other provinces. So it's another thing for people who are looking to land somewhere in Canada, is that BC often pays the most fee split for an independent contractor.
Absolutely. It's not just the best place to live on earth, but best places for a physiotherapist to work on earth.
Yes, I agree.
That's true. So the split can range, 50-50 is sort of the baseline. It can range from 45 to 60% usually, with 45% being a really young, inexperienced therapist who just starting out. usually on supervision plans, and 60% would be really experienced, 10 plus years experience, a lot of other specialties like acupuncture or spinal manipulation or vestibular therapy perhaps. So that's where the split will range. Obviously, every clinic will negotiate their own percentage and their own schedule to increase it. But that's roughly where most of the split ranges in BC falls. Clinic usually will supply all the things you need to practice, so all the equipment. They will provide some marketing. It's usually already established clinic. They will provide all administrative and billing services. Just to give an example what this means, so for very, very rough take, if somebody has 55% split and they received the salary will be about $8,000 to $12,000 per month if you work full time. It obviously will depend how much treatment charges, how much the clinic charges per treatment. It will matter how busy you are. It matters how many patients per hour you see, etc. But those roughly the wages. Somebody who's, let's say, 55%, so fairly experienced and has some subspecialties, looking to get in the ballpark in this range. Some will get less if they work really less hours. Some will get more if they're really, really busy or see more patients per hour. But that's, I would say, where a lot of our salaries, or should we call it income, falls. Does it kind of make sense to you, Katelyn?
Yeah, that does. Yes, yes, that's very helpful to see it all kind of laid out and broken out.
Okay. So as a contractor, there is of course a great chance for profit. The more patients you see, the more money you will get. There is no other way to put it. There is though a chance for loss as well. If, as I said, the patient or insurer did not pay, there will be a loss directly to a therapist as well. If you're not busy for some reason, you'll be getting less pay. And being not busy doesn't mean necessarily a therapist is not good at work. You can be the best therapist ever, but for example, there can be snow. And we had cases when there is nobody could come to the clinic for a week. It was just not safe. There can be situations as, for example, there is other clinic opens next door, so the clinic gets less busy in general. So you take some risk of being not busy. And finally, the other big risk is taking time off work. For example, if you decide to take a 4 months vacation, you're not going to get paid at all for 1 month. So any kind of loss, whether it's time of work, whether it's expected or unexpected, let's say you broke your hand and can't work for 8 weeks, you're not going to generate any income and there is no coverage in place. You are also responsible for your own taxes, means that you usually can have some write-offs. So as you run your own business, so to say, you can write off, for example, your expenses for taking PT exam prep course. You can write off some of your insurance, college expenses. You can write off expenses related to your car if you have a drive to work, and so on. It's best to speak to a good accountant about that, but you certainly get more tax benefits compared to regular employee. Here is the big one though. As we mentioned before, CRA, Canada Revenue Agency, may audit you. And you must have a good written contract and good contract policies in place, because otherwise they can deem you, although you claim to be independent contractor, they can easily claim you to be an employee, and then you'll be owing a lot of money for all your write-offs, a lot of penalties related to that. It can hit both the therapist and the clinic quite significantly.
So as a person who is looking for a job, and if they do get to the point where they are kind of negotiating on the contract, as a new therapist, are there things that you should look for in that contract?
Yes, we'll touch base on that a tiny bit later, but really I would suggest get good advice. You can find some nice resources on physiotherapy of British Physiotherapy Association of British Columbia, PABC. They have some good guidelines for that. You have to be a member to access them, of course, which I do recommend, by the way. You can talk to lawyer or accountant. That would be really the optimal. It may cost a little bit of money, but they can give you advice on how to do it properly and how to set yourself up. You certainly should talk to a clinic owner if they are aware. But in the end of the day, there is no 100% proven policy that will 100% guarantee you are independent contractor and not employee. CRA always looks at this as a big picture. There is no one single item that you can check and say, oh, I'm now a contractor or I'm employee. They look on a lot of different factors. I can easily do a 2-hour lecture just on that.
Yeah.
But bottom line, get some solid advice, especially if you're starting out. Don't.
Okay, good to know.
Right? That would be the bottom line advice. Another thing, as I said, you may want to look some of your own family benefits. There are plenty of companies such as Blue Cross that offer self-employed contractors benefits packages. It's usually not very lucrative financially, but it may work for some people. I certainly would recommend to get personal disability insurance. For again, if you're a therapist working in private clinic, manual therapy, you fell down skiing, broke your hand, you may be off 12 weeks to work till you reasonably can use your hands. I would suggest to have some disability in place. It's usually worth it. Also, retirement savings plan you can do for yourself. It's a good way to save on taxes. I've done them very late in my career, I think, but I think I should have done them way earlier.
Yeah, that's a tough one. We all should start that one early, hey?
Exactly. Well, my experience, physios are, unlike other professions such as massage therapists or chiropractors, are very oblivious to all these parts. They just want to work and help people, but they don't think, okay, I'm going to get older one day. I may not be able to do it for the next 40 years. They don't look for the sort of what if situation. And it's important to look early. The earliest you start doing this, the better it will be. Yeah. Very important when you're looking on the contractor, and I think this is really, make sure the clinic is busy. I always say this, 80% of zero is still zero. Somebody offers you an insane split. If you have to chase your own clients, it may not work for you if you're just starting out. It's best to go to the clinic that is established, can provide you the clientele, can provide you the caseload.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Okay. So let's move on a little bit. Any questions so far about all those employment options? Anything?
Yeah, so I mean, my main question would be, as an interim physiotherapist, I know a lot of our students feel like they don't really have too much room to negotiate or too much room to kind of make that decision of which of those they should go with. But as an intern, you obviously do need to have someone check your charts and be semi-supervised. Is there one of those that you would suggest to them to root for or to hope that that's kind of what they get?
Well, there is no right or wrong, and the clinic usually will have, some will have more than one option. For example, in my clinics, I have both employee and contractor options. You really, I think, first of all, it's okay to negotiate even if you are on interim. You certainly can be worth more than you think. When I moved to Canada, I'll be honest, I started on 40%, which is insanely bad. And I was already fairly experienced therapist and I already had my needling credentials. So I should have started at least at 45, but I didn't know much and I was sort of taken advantage of. Mm-hmm. So you can absolutely negotiate for percentage or hourly wage for a better deal. It's totally normal. So I wouldn't say don't negotiate anyway. In terms of getting a proper supervision in place, this is important. I think it should be taken into consideration who is the clinic, who is your supervisor, and most importantly, how available your supervisor is going to be. You can have the best supervisor in the world. If he comes to the clinics once a week for an hour, you're not going to get much out of it.
Right. Okay, no, that's helpful. And what about if you wanted to start off as, the employee agreement and, as you're starting out and then as you start to get busier, you wanted to go into that contractor position. Is that something that you can do?
That's a great question, and I have to say I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a specialist in labor law and tax law. I would say more no than yes. The reason being, if CRA will ever audit you, they'll have to be a very significant amount of evidence that say why you change your position. Again, by CRA default policy, they like to see everybody as employees. CRA's job to get more taxes, there is no secret. They're not going to necessarily see you what benefits you. So let's say you've been having $100,000 a year salary and you've been paying $35,000 in taxes. They're not necessarily going to be happy you're going to change it to contractor, going to make $120,000 salary and pay just $20,000 in taxes. So you have to be very, very clear how you do it. I would certainly say if you get busy and want to work as independent, then option of renting a room is a good option because that gives enough separation. I've been employee and now I'm leasing out the space. That gives you the appropriate separation. If you work in the same clinic and then you decide, oh, I want to be contractor, and then after some time you decide, no, I want to be employee again, that doesn't really work like that.
Gotcha. Okay, no, that's really, really helpful. Thank you.
This is not a legal advice, I have to say.
No, it's just good to get, someone who owns a clinic and has seen kind of the patterns or the ways that people are wanting to work. And I think you kind of nailed it there. There needs to be a clear division in why you're switching from an employee contract to a contractor. So that's really helpful.
Yes, I have to say, just because we all have this hope, me included, we all have this hope everybody else are doing that, it doesn't mean you should be doing that, because CRA audits individuals. And if you're not lucky and they may look into you and you can say, but all my friends doing the same thing, that's not really going to fly with them, unfortunately.
No, exactly. Yeah, ignorance is not a plea that you can play here.
That's true. So let's move on to some specifics of a contract when you do ready to sign a contract. And this is obviously more specific to a subcontractor, to independent contractor agreement. Employees in general, they can have an agreement, but it's actually not a necessity. You can be an employee without any agreement. But for contractor, you have to have an agreement. You are a contractor. Many different contracts are used throughout province, but most are very, very similar. I'm just put this in here. There is no single contract that everybody uses. It's okay. The different clinics will have different contracts. Some use Canadian Physiotherapy Association contract. Some use PABC contract. It's fine. They're all about the same. You just need to read through them. Here again, we go over the CRA compliance. It has the main things is opportunity for profit or loss. The contract have specified what is not covered. So things like I specify in my contract, I don't cover your WCB, I don't cover your EI, I don't cover your CPP, I don't cover your sick leave, I don't cover any extra expenses that you may bring your equipment that is not included in the clinic. It has to be very, very specific because that's what they look for. And it should also have clear obligations on a therapist, such as you do your own insurance, you do your own WCB, you do your own business license if you live in municipality when it's applicable, and so on. There is also common standard that some of them would ask you to pay a small rental agreement within your contract. Let's say you do a $500 a month rental agreement regardless, and you're going to be sort of compensated back for that. Not sure how much sense it makes, but the more obligations there are in your contract, the better it is on both ends. Okay. It's not good if the contract is just say, you come to work, you get 50% of what you bill, and you go home. That's not a good arrangement. CRA will deem this employee situation. They'll deem it's a commissioned employee. It's can be very confusing, and people smarter than me have devoted life to study this subject. So it's not to give answers specifically, it's just to give an idea. It's worthwhile to look into, and always good idea to get a lawyer's and accountant advice.
Totally. And information is power. And just to even, know that there are certain things that the CRA needs to be compliant with in the contract, hopefully will motivate some of these, people who are coming to Canada to know the importance that they do need to get their contract looked at for their safety and, to make sure that it's compliant with the CRA.
Absolutely, and I assure you, being a clinic owner, I'm not going to look down on anybody who says, okay, let me take a week to look and review this contract. I'll actually happy when they do it. It shows the therapist invested in their career. And that's the thing. It's nothing wrong to ask. Another thing, after you do sign the contract, get a copy, right? If you don't get a copy, you're not in a good situation.
No, that's true. That's good advice. You can forget that piece sometimes.
You'll be surprised the things that happen. Like, I wasn't offered my first contract. I was just signed. I was happy I'm working. But if I needed to use it, I would be helpless if it came to that situation. Other points that just a few points you'll see in most of the contract. There is a non-competition. So usually a clinic will ask to sign certain time and radius to protect their business. So you can't open the clinic next door on your own. It does have a questionable utility in legal world because non-competition agreement really can't be valid in many cases. It's the most important. It has to be reasonable on a geographic region and a reasonable time frame. For example, in Vancouver, 6 months, 5 kilometers would be something fairly reasonable. But if you put, let's say, in Vancouver, 2 years and 20 kilometers, it means a person living in Vancouver will never be able to find a reasonable job. Right. That won't be valid in any court. And you don't want, when you're discussing with your employers, when you're discussing those things, you want to make sure it is reasonable, because otherwise it leaves this whole gray area. I signed a huge non-competition agreement, and on the other hand, I know it's not going to be valid, but it creates unclarity in the situation. It's best to be honest, have a clear understanding what you can and cannot do, and work ethically within it. I'll give you an example. In my career early, I signed a non-competition agreement for 5 years and 10 kilometers radius. It was thankfully in the fairly remote area from where I live now, so it didn't affect me, but it would be pretty insane if I was living in the same town. It would mean I can't work in the town I live for 5 years. Again, that's not something that is constitutional. Does this make a little bit sense?
100%, yeah.
Perfect. Other thing to notice is termination period. Nobody thinks about that, but a lot of time people go separate way for different reasons. So importance of this termination period, it is to ensure the coverage for patients. You can't leave and tomorrow there is nobody to take care of them. On the other hand, you don't want your employer to be able to tell you, okay, your termination agreement is 3 months because you'll never find another job, right? We want to be something reasonable, that there is a care for patients and enough carryover, and there is also, you can get a reasonable time frame to get another job, let's say. So usually I would say 30 days is standard for that. But sometimes I've seen that you have to let your clinic know that you're terminating agreement 3 months in advance. It's going to be very difficult to actually make a change if you're looking to change your work. Nobody will wait for you 3 months till you'll be available. And finally, make sure there is I found it in some contracts, people put time off. Make sure you can take time off without hiring a locum. The whole idea of being independent contractors, you control when you show up to work and when you're not. You don't show up, you don't get paid. You show up, you get paid essentially. But some clinics put restriction, and I've seen very strange things, like if you miss 1 day of work, you have to find a replacement to work this day, which would be pretty much impossible in PC market. Yes. And not to mention, not make sense to your patients or to the clinic, but make sure that you can take time off and you don't have to be, your clinic owner can't restrict you in that. Again, it has to be reasonable. Like we put some, I don't remember what they are honestly, but reasonable restrictions that you have to give, I think, to the clinic about, I think 3 weeks notice for every week that you're going to take off. So we would like to know and get a heads up, but that's about it.
Yeah,
right? It doesn't mean that that you can't take it, or you have to find a locum to take your own vacation or sick time or whatever.
Okay. On that, we do have some students who, they want to work with a clinic who will support them to take a little bit of time off before taking their exam. So say, we have the June and November practical, and they're usually looking to take about 2 to 3 weeks off before that exam. I mean, in your experience, is that something that is fairly easy to negotiate at the onset of the agreement?
Well, absolutely. It will depend on individual clinic, how they look at things, but I think any clinic owner will want you to study well for exam, because if you don't pass it, you don't get to work in BC anymore, exactly. 99% of cases. Yeah. So you really, I made some of my interim physiotherapists, I made them take time off. But again, make sure you have the right in the contract. It's really shouldn't be up to your employer encouraging you or not. If you're a contractor, you should be the one deciding what you're doing. This is the whole idea. If you're an employee, it can be a little bit different. Then your employer can say no to your vacation, or yes, or sponsor you, whatever. If you're independent contractor, well, you're independent. You decide when you take time off. But it's certainly something I'll touch base in the interview. I would like to, usually most of us are honest people. You want to give them heads up, hey, I'm going to have this exam in half a year. I'll need 2 or 3 weeks of work and maybe 2 days to relax after, which I also suggest.
That's very kind of you. A lot of people, as you said, I think physios are just eager to get to work. So that's one of those things that, I usually encourage our students as well is, as you're getting closer to the exam, you really do need to prepare and be respectful to your employer and let them know in advance that you're planning on taking whatever duration is for that exam off.
Yeah, just to be, so to say, devil's advocate, I have to say, so if you're an independent contractor and you take 3 weeks off, you may entirely lose your whole caseload because it will have to go elsewhere. So there is a lot of pros and cons, and there is no right and wrong, and this is where you have to decide. You have to decide. For example, when I took my exams, I took very little time off, but I was very, very aware of that, and I took enough time off to study before. Some people would prefer those 2 or 3 weeks. I think it's individual, and again, there is no right or wrong, but yeah, make sure you pass the exam for sure.
Yes.
Okay, let's move on. So finally, we're almost there. We're going to go over some College of Physiotherapists of BC guidelines. So first of all, this is very important to understand. The role of college is to protect the public. Association represents physiotherapists' interests. The college doesn't represent necessarily interest of the physical therapists. They are very nice people, super helpful. I've dealt with them many times on different subjects. They're really, really helpful with any question you have, whether it's supervision, on interim registration, and especially practice questions. They'll really like doing that. That's their job. But remember that they're not going to always see how it fits you. They're going to see what the law says, and they don't make the law. The law is made for them, essentially. Mm-hmm. I really recommend everybody to go on their website. The link is in the presentation. There is almost every possible case scenario reviewed there. So any questions you have practice related, this is the first place to look. You probably will find an answer there. College, again, this is something to know. College governs therapists and not clinics. This is the example I put here. If something happened, let's say you put a patient on your bed and the bed broke and the patient fell and sprained the wrist, he will still take to court the individual therapist who did the practice, who practiced with him. Even though the bed is bought by the clinic and maintained by the clinic and so on, you as a therapist have full responsibility to ensure the safety. You should have, by the way college looks at it, you should have looked at the bed before you put the patient on it and ensured it's not broken and in its good condition. Same would apply pretty much to everything. It doesn't mean clinic doesn't have its own liability there, it does. but you are liable. Don't think for a second if you work for a big organization, the organization will take the blame. You did, even, and this will apply even to the hospital. You did something wrong, you can be personally liable. You can take the hit. Okay, does this part make sense?
That's a really, really good point, and especially for students who are watching this right now and studying for their upcoming exams. That's a really good point to know for your exam. You ultimately are responsible, and you give the example of the bed. Well, one of the biggest things we say in the practical exam is make sure that you check the brakes. The brakes check should be something that you do, immediately going into that station. And it's not kind of this, funny habit we want them to get into. It's truly because we want you to know that it is your responsibility to always have the patient's safety in mind with whatever you do. So it's a really good point to bring up.
Yes, I think quite a few therapists didn't become therapists because they didn't check the brakes. Always check the brakes.
Right?
And same in the clinic. I actually had to review with a therapist yesterday, with massage therapist. She didn't know how to check if the brakes on her back closed or open. And that's something we are aware of. We need to know that even you work for a clinic and there is 20 other therapists there, and clinics take care everything for you. You're still liable. Make sure you are safe with what you do, and you are applying to your own kind of what feels right for you, and not necessarily what clinic presents, because you will be the one liable.
Yes, no, good.
Okay. Yes. So some other things. So supervision plan, I just very briefly touch on that. Of course, it's required for every physiotherapist who hadn't passed both exams yet. It doesn't remove liability from the supervised therapist. Even you have a supervisor, you're not a student. It's all on you. Your supervisor is just a technical role. If you do something wrong, you did something wrong. It requires physical hands-on supervision. Your supervisor cannot be in another town. It cannot supervise you on Skype. They have to be on site. There is a requirement that may be a bit out of practical line from the college, but there is a requirement for supervisor to be on site to give you hands-on supervision. Also, supervisor cannot supervise you on things he doesn't know himself. For example, if you come from UK, a lot of the UK therapists are very much familiar with acupuncture, and they may want to do acupuncture on their students. Even if their program is accepted by college for acupuncture, unless your supervisor is certified to do acupuncture as well, you cannot do it. Does it make sense, Katelyn?
100%, yes.
Okay, so we have to be able that our supervisor can take some sort of responsibility. If you, for example, decide to do pelvic floor, but your supervisor doesn't do pelvic floor, it may be a problem there if something happens, because you don't have a supervisor that can specifically supervise you in those techniques you are doing.
Very important.
Yeah, and this is not necessarily it's college related, but college does, once you supervised, college requires your supervisor to review your billings. But I do strongly suggest you start reviewing your own billings from day one, especially if you're independent contractors. It's a great habit to not to get in trouble, because you are making sure you charge patients for services you provided. And sometimes clinic will overcharge by mistake, you'll still be liable. Again, even if it's the clinic secretary that did the mistake, it's their admin failure, you are still liable for not checking that. And second, we saw a huge increase in payments for therapists who are actually on top of their billings. You actually will get more money if you know how to bill properly. No best reception team in the world not gonna be as good as you are if you check your own billings. So I do suggest everybody to start checking their billings from day one, and certainly every clinic has a legal obligation to give you full access how the billing goes, and have access to all the billing records. And finally, as we said, you have to pass the exam. Katelyn probably knows much more, but I think nowadays it's 99%, if not 100%. If you fail, they take away your license.
Yeah, if you fail your practical exam and you have an interim license, you will get your license revoked, and you won't be able to practice. And I mean, there's lots of implications to that, but one of the big implications is the practical exam is only offered, 2 times a year. So you take the June exam, you have to wait around kind of 10 to 12 weeks for those results. If you then find out that you have failed, you're not getting to take the exam again until November, and you're not getting to practice until about 10 to 12 weeks after that. So, you fail June, you're not looking to practice probably again until January, February, which is a long time.
Yeah, so again, guys, pass the exam, do your best to really study hard and take all the help you can. It's certainly worth it. Some practice standards. This is, I think, more or less the last slide I have here. So there is a link again that lists all the practice standards, couple of those that can be practical for most of you. Acupuncture, dry needling, it's not enough that you have training. You need to college approve your program first. There's actually what's called a roster. So you need to send your acupuncture information to a college, and it takes them a few days to make sure it's all valid and approve it. Very important to make sure to record consent to treatment in every chart entry. It's usually what a lot of college complaints, I try to follow up those very closely. At least 50% of college complaints made by patients to the college will have a problem with consent. You need to consent for everything. Even if you ask your patient, is it okay if I'm gonna manipulate your back, make sure you put it in verbal consent given. It's better than nothing. Okay, and another thing about that, it's even if you sign all kinds of intake forms with consents, it still doesn't make this consent absolute. If you do something this form doesn't specifically specify, or it's too complex for patients to understand, you still need to sign a consent form again, or to sign a verbal consent. You have to be sure patient understands the treatment and the risks involved, not just by signing form at the reception. Finally, there's something that I see a lot for therapists educated overseas. Guys, you have to chart. We all can chart better, I'm sure, but I find a lot of people who graduated in Canadian universities chart so much better. And you have to chart. It's a common, when things happen and you don't have chart notes in place or incomplete chart notes, you can get in trouble. Some other areas, spinal manipulation. In BC, a little bit of gray area. Essentially, all it says, you need to be able to prove you're competent. It's different in other provinces. In Alberta, for example, you have to, like acupuncture in BC, you have to be on a roster. You have to prove your level of education before you can do it. In BC, there is no real restriction. But essentially, if something happens, you better have something to show up. You've been professionally taught the techniques you used and you know how to use them safely. Don't just watch a YouTube video how to manipulate upper cervical spine and say, hey, this is what I did. Specialty treatments. This is strange, but pelvic floor, TMJ, vestibular, etc. There are no specific restrictions actually, although there is a practice standard for pelvic floor. Anybody can do it. Which is bizarre because I never been trained any of this stuff. But yes, please be aware that even though there is no restrictions, for example, for vestibular therapy, there is a clear bylaw that makes you work within your own competence. If you charge patient for vestibular therapy and instead massage their neck, you will be liable. You have to be sure. And that please understand that what you do, you can actually do it. Don't just make it up, because there can be implications for that as well. Finally, I do encourage everybody to understand what PIPA is and how it applies to physiotherapists. PIPA is Privacy Information Protection Act, probably one of the most common reasons of complaints. You talk to somebody had a car accident, you talk to their adjuster and said they're not doing too badly. That's a very, very common complaint to the college. You release their information without consent, you gave inaccurate diagnosis, you impacted their claim, you'll get in trouble. Okay, please understand what you can release and what you can't release. Don't email your patients their private stuff over your cell phone, for example. That's another big one. Make sure you have a proper ways of communicating things with patients. Any questions about any of that?
No, I think maybe one more thing to kind of touch on with that is, Igor, of course, is coming from this from a standpoint of being a British Columbia physiotherapist. And, a lot of the information presented today is from that viewpoint. So if you are someone who is watching this and you live in other provinces around Canada, just make sure that you look into your own province's bylaws and practice standards. Because for us, what we have with our insurance company may be different with yours. And that's not something that you want to be uneducated in. And it is tough because for the exam, they're going to be asking you questions that apply to Canada as a whole. So you're not often studying these smaller details of the provinces because it is a Canada-wide exam. After you have finished and potentially you're working, that's when you really need to make sure that you've taken the time and looking into your province's specific information.
Yeah, that's a great point, Katelyn. Let's move on a little bit. If anybody has questions, they're welcome. Here is my email. That's the best way to get in touch with me. Feel free to email me with any questions about anything. I'll do my best to reply promptly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Igor. I wanted to talk a little bit more about kind of one of the relationships that we have with you. And so, you can go to our website at ptprep.ca and you can go to employment sponsorship, which I'm just showing here. And on the next slide, it'll just show you a little bit about what happens in our employment sponsorship program. So we have clinics across BC who are looking to help support international physios to come to Canada and specifically to BC. So Igor works at Coast Therapy. His bio is perfect there on the screen. So if you are someone who is landed in BC or looking to land in BC, and you have completed your written, you're looking to do your practical, Igor would be happy to work with you and to get you onto his team if it is something that would be a good fit. So you can apply to him sending your resume and cover letter, and it's listed there where to send it to. But yeah, one of the big things with PT Exam Prep is we just want to give you as much information as possible. And we want to make sure that when you are choosing to work at a clinic in BC, it is a reputable clinic for one. Something that Igor touched on is that it's a clinic that does have an established caseload, because that is going to give you that experience and mentorship. And it's really nice to work with someone too who has experience in coming to Canada as an international physiotherapist. So you're the perfect person to talk to about this, and I thank you so much for giving us your time today. And I know there's going to be a lot of students who are very thankful as well. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, you do a great thing. And again, I only wished something like that existed when I was going through exams. But yeah, I'm very happy you helping people who come from overseas to succeed in Canada. It's a beautiful BC, especially beautiful place to work, and it's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. So again, that just concludes our presentation today. If anyone does have any questions, you can send away to Igor, or you can contact us ourselves. All right. Thank you, Igor.